On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to go back in history to find the founding of our nation and all of the ramifications that historians have told us about. And we especially have the DVD, which you see behind me. It's called The Secret Mysteries of America's Beginnings, The New Atlantis. When Christopher Columbus discovered America, word was throughout England was he had found the new Atlantis, or he had found Atlantis at last. That ancient city that Plato talked about, that sank beneath the sea. Suddenly we have a land beyond the Atlantic. And so we have the writer and director of this DVD with us today. Gary Stearman is here. Gary is going to introduce our guest.
And JR, it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Pinto, a producer, director, narrator of Riddles in Stone and America's Beginnings. We're going to talk about America's Beginnings. Chris, welcome to Prophecy in the News.
Well, thanks for having me.
Let's open with an idea. I think a lot of our viewers would think of America as a Christian nation. I think of America as a Christian nation,
Right.
which it is, and thank God for it. But when our nation was founded, there were really two competing ideas at work, and they're still there today. Tell us about your DVDs.
Yeah, I think the competing ideas are best represented by the two colonies that were formed at the beginning. You have the Jamestown colony that was 1607, and then the Plymouth colony in 1620. The Jamestown colony was heavily financed by a guy named Sir Francis Bacon in England during the Elizabethan era. And Bacon believed, he was one of those who believed, he was the chief of the Rosicrucian Society in England, and they believed that when America was discovered, that it was the location for the lost empire of Atlantis. And they had a very different idea of how they believed this country should unfold and what the destiny of America was supposed to be. Now, when the Puritans and the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, they were Christians, certainly, William Bradford and so on. And Bradford, when he instituted private property ownership, did so specifically based upon biblical precepts, you know, and the ideas of, you know, God bringing the children of Israel into the promised land and then giving them each their own piece of land and so on. Those were the principles that were being adopted, the work ethic, you do not work, you shall not eat, and so on, that Bradford set forth. But the Jamestown colony initially was kind of a horror story. You know, they had all sorts of problems with famine, and they were struggling, and disease and so on. And it really wasn't Jamestown that inspired people to come to America, but it was Plymouth. Nevertheless, you had these members of these secret societies that ultimately would infiltrate all of the colonies. And they began working from within with this inner agenda for what they envisioned America to be. And it's, I would say, if I could pull a quote out, it's one that we use in the film. It's from Manly P. Hall. He talks about how the pagan intellectuals reclothed their original ideas in a garment of Christian phraseology. So in other words, they outwardly presented themselves to be Christians,
Yes.
you know, but inwardly they held these secret society ideas.
Now, let's go back to Greek mythology for a little bit and talk about some of the underlying principles of Rosicrucianism and the secret societies. We have Athena, Apollo, and so on. Tell us how you put it together in this fabulous DVD on the secret mysteries of America's beginnings. Tell us about the Greek background.
Well, the Rosicrucianism is people might remember from Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, where he talks about things being sub rosa, beneath the rose. The rose is a symbol for secrecy and a symbol for the ancient mystery religion. And in Rosicrucianism, what they do is they combine the rose with the cross. And the cross symbolizes Christianity, of course, and Rosicrucianism is the combining of the two. So a Rosicrucian, like Sir Francis Bacon, if you read his book, The New Atlantis, which is subtitled The Land of the Rosicrucians, or The Land of the Rosicrucians, he's writing about these Christian sailors who have come to this lost island and this place called Ben Salam and so on. And a lot of what he's saying sort of sounds Christian. You know, when you're reading what he's talking about the Lord Jesus, he's talking about the cross, he's talking about these different ideas that have a Christian sound to them. But then he's combining in his other writings, you know, Pallas Athena and the gods and the goddesses of Greek and Roman mythology.
It sounds like Gnosticism, don't you think, Gary?
Very much so. In fact, Gnosticism, J.R., was what Paul battled against as an apostle. He traveled about the Greco-Roman Empire, and his enemies were Christian converts who didn't want to give up the old Gnostic ideas.
The pagan ideas of Athena and Apollo.
Exactly.
In fact, when John wrote the book of Revelation, he talked about the seat of Satan.
Yes.
And Satan was Zeus, the father of Apollo and Diana. And he talked about the various ways that Apollo would show up in the end time. In the book of Revelation, which early theologians called the apocalypse, he talked about this star falling from heaven and the bottomless pit being opened up and all of these creatures coming out, and the head of them was this star that had fallen from heaven, and his name was Apollonius, or that's a variation of the Greek Apollo.
Right.
And so we've got in the end time a resurrection of ancient Gnosticism. Isn't that amazing?
Wow. That, you know, J.R., that is amazing. And that idea, by the way, is what Chris carries through in these DVDs. Let's talk about Gnosticism a minute. What does Gnosticism believe? Where does its power come from? It's worshiping and following something. What's it following?
Well, I think, you know, there's a lot of ways you could explain it because there's all kinds of different sects of Gnosticism. But the way that makes the most sense to me is how it's explained by Madame Blavatsky. Madame Blavatsky was the 19th century cultist who wrote her book, The Secret Doctrine and Isis Unveiled, and founded the Theosophical Society. Anyway, she writes in The Secret Doctrine, she uses a Latin phrase where she says, demon est deus inversus. The devil is God inverted. And it represents what the Gnostics believe. They go back to the Garden of Eden, and you have God who created Adam and Eve and forbade them to partake of the tree of knowledge, or gnosis. And then you have the serpent who comes along, and he tells Eve, no, you should partake of this tree of knowledge because your eyes will be opened and you shall be as gods. And what the Gnostics do is they invert God and the devil. They say that God, who forbade man from partaking of the tree, is really the devil. He's a spirit of darkness and evil and so on. But that the serpent, Lucifer, is really an angel of light.
Aha, Lucifer. Have my Bible open to Isaiah 14:12, where it says, how art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. When Christians read about Lucifer, we automatically think of him as Satan. I mean, and a very dark figure, not a figure of light.
Right. Well, the Bible tells us, you know, Satan transforms himself into an angel of light. And that's very much what you find when you go into these secret societies and you read about their philosophies and their ideas. They're all writing about this progression toward the light. The Rosicrucians were known for saying, give us more light, more light. But the way that they sought light, guys like Dr. John Dee and Francis Bacon, who were the leaders of this movement, the way that they would seek light is to summon spirits from the spirit world to give them knowledge, you know, gnosis, to give them knowledge about science and inventions and herbs and nature and things like that. One of the root words for, or the meanings of the word demon or daimon, one of the root meanings of that is a knowing one who knows. And so they would seek these spirits out, you know, to give them this secret knowledge.
Secret knowledge, J.R. You know, that takes us all the way back to the early earth, to Mount Hermon, the descent of evil spirits, doesn't it?
It certainly does. And they were the Titans that became the Greek gods. And then the Olympians fought the Titans according to the ancient Greek mythology and won. And so Zeus became the king of the gods. Well, Basically, we're seeing that rising again today. We're seeing the United States moving toward a one-world government. We had leaders from 20 nations meeting in Washington, D.C. this past month, and they discussed one major theme, and that was a new world order. Getting rid of the dollar, establishing a new world currency, putting some kind of a multinational board of directors to watch over the new currency so that it would be stabilized. It's amazing the way the world is going today. And, you know, it's interesting that there are so many wars and rumors of wars going on. We have this war in Iraq and Afghanistan. If there was no devil, we wouldn't have these wars. But because there is a devil and demons, we're having a continual warring faction that is put into this. But it's designed in order to bring about a one world government. And they lay the wars at the feet of the Christians. Isn't that amazing?
This is getting more interesting every moment. Chris Pinto, producer, director of the DVDs we're talking about today. And we have been talking about the way America was founded, the colonial period. Chris, I would like to now move us forward a little bit to the days of the drafting of our Constitution. The Founding Fathers, and they are greatly admired, and probably should be. And yet, you put a slightly different spin on that period of time.
Yeah, I usually, when people say, you know, we're the Founding Fathers Christians, I usually ask, all right, well, which of them do you mean? Because certainly some of them were. When you get into guys like Andrew Jackson, Patrick Henry, and so on, I think you have very solid Bible-believing Christian men. When you get into Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, there you've got some real issues if you're going to try and prove these guys were Christians. Benjamin Franklin, we talk about a good bit in Secret Mysteries Part 1. Franklin was heavily involved in secret societies in America, in England, and in France, the three countries that were involved in the American Revolution. And he was involved with a group over in England called the Hellfire Club.
Wow.
That routinely was known for, you know, drunken parties and debauching women, and they would dress up and mock Christianity and so on. So it's kind of hard to see Benjamin Franklin in that light than as any kind of a Christian. And of course he was known for, you know, being sort of an immoral man where the ladies are concerned, that he was always chasing women. That's something that they'll admit even on the History Channel and so on. But then you get into Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson, who's known for his Jefferson Bible, specifically developed his Jefferson Bible. Some will say that he developed it because he just wanted to focus on the morality, the moral teachings of Jesus. But if you go into Jefferson's own writings, which can be found in the Library of Congress, and you read the comments that he said about developing this Jefferson Bible, he said that he believed the real teachings of Jesus were found in the New Testament, but that they were covered up by the words of inferior minds. And that's the terminology he used. And what he felt he had to do was to pull the diamonds out of the dunghill. And he used the word dunghill. Now what he considered the dunghill were things like the virgin birth, the resurrection of Christ, the miracles that Jesus performed, and so on. He said he thought the book of Revelation was nothing more than the ravings of a lunatic. And that's, again, quote-unquote, Thomas Jefferson. And then he believed that Jesus was the illegitimate child of Mary and a Roman soldier. Okay, so...
Not very Christian.
Yeah, not very Christian at all.
And yet somehow out of this came our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, our Declaration of Independence, all of these hallowed documents, and, by the way, a nation dedicated to liberty. And you know, we have been the diamond that the rest of the world looked at and envied for all of these years.
Right.
What's going on here?
That's a good question. I think it really hinges around how you define the idea of liberty, you know, and freedom. And there were those who believed that liberty and freedom from a biblical perspective gives you the freedom to believe God according to his word and to obey his commands without being hindered, and so on. Then there are those who believe, I think as we're warned in the book of Jude, that they turn the grace of God into licentiousness, into a license for committing sin, and that they believe that liberty is for that purpose, to allow them to do whatever they want to do without any boundaries, and so on. And you find those elements in early America. I mean, you find them going back to the Puritan Pilgrims with William Bradford. He's writing about if you get the book by Bradford on the history of the Plymouth Plantation, he writes about a neighboring colony that was involved in all kinds of immoral behavior and so on, and how they were resurrecting pagan practices even then. But they set those things in order very quickly. And that conflict seems to have continued up to the time of the American Revolution. And you have some who are very solid Christian men, and then you have others who have these sort of pagan ideas about what American freedom and liberty should be about. Not unlike what we see in our country today.
Now, you mentioned a few moments ago about Jamestown and the Plymouth colony, and how that Governor Bradford decided that socialism was not going to work. I understand that at first the people were owned by the sponsoring company in England who sent them over there. This is our land, you work the land, and we give you a percentage. But finally, noticing that able-bodied men weren't willing to work for somebody else, Governor Bradford decided that we would have private property, and so he began to divide up the plots of land and gave each person the ability to make something of that land, and so that was the underlying philosophy behind free enterprise. Socialism did not work. Socialism was the first among the first organizations in America, and it just failed. People didn't have an incentive to work for themselves. And so when we come to the Constitution, this life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, tell us about how that came about.
Well, the original American motto, stemming from Bradford and the Plymouth colony, was life, liberty, and property. That was the original view, because private property ownership was seen as essential to the preservation of freedom, because it motivated people to work.
Yeah.
And as you said, the socialist ideas, which are really based on the class structure of the ancient world, where you have the elite, the nobles, and then the serfs, the peasants beneath them, who do all the work for the nobles.
Yes.
And that's really the idea of communism, even though they won't admit that out loud.
That's one of the main reasons for the Dark Ages, isn't it, in medieval Europe? Because
Absolutely.
the population were serfs just working for the king.
And so they had no motivation. And so with Bradford now, instituting private property, the American colonization movement just took off. It exploded because people realized, if I grow 1,000 bushels of corn, it's my corn. I can do with it whatever I want. Or if I raise 1,000 cattle and so on, then they're my cattle. And this really motivated people at the beginning. But Thomas Jefferson, it's believed, when he was drafting the Declaration of Independence and so on, and influencing the Constitution, changed the motto from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And some people believe that it was based upon the influence that these secret societies over in Europe were having upon Jefferson and Franklin and others.
Well, Chris, as we speak about this, I'm getting a clearer picture. It seems to me that from the beginning, there have been 2 points of view. One, we might call Christian conservatism, or the belief in Christ as Savior and the dedication of our lives to Him spiritually, and developing a culture around that idea. The other group, call them socialistic idealists, or whatever you want to call them. We have these 2 opposing groups, and it appears to me that that's still going on to this day.
Yeah, I would completely agree, and that's really what our documentary series is about, is showing, because a lot of Christians, I think, from what I've seen, seem to think that America was a Christian nation until 1960, when they took prayer out of schools, and then everything went south. Everything went downhill from there. And what we're trying to show is that this conflict that we're seeing today between traditional Christianity and the values that our country was founded on, and this progressive socialist communist, kind of pagan movement that's fighting against us every step of the way, that this has been here, this conflict has been here from the beginning. It's just that in centuries past, those who held to these pagan ideals were hiding behind the cloak of Christianity. They were outwardly pretending they were Christian because the greater cultural population of America was Christian.
Well, even in the last election, we divide the continent into red and blue. And two different colors, two different ideas. I think, JR, even this last election was those two competing ideas, the socialist ideal versus the Christian conservative ideal.
Absolutely. And, of course, when people can vote themselves money from the national treasury, they're going to vote for the person who promises them the best deal.
Yes.
Now, let's go back, for example, to the founding of Israel under Joshua. Joshua gave each family a parcel of land, and that family owned that land from time immemorial. However, when Israel was reconstituted in 1948, they came in with the idea of kibbutz. The land doesn't belong to any one particular individual. Everybody works for the good of the whole. That's socialism. It didn't work. It doesn't work. What we see is America originally was founded under the idea of private property. But now, what happened to this idea of private property when property taxes come in and continues year after year until death? And the state has the actual ability of eminent domain to take the property away from the individual.
See, I think that property taxes are the subtle working of these secret arcane groups in our government, and it's their way of destroying, because one of the tenets of communism is the abolishment of private property, and I think this is their way of taking away real private property ownership. If you were to go out, or if any of us went out and we bought a pair of shoes, you would buy the shoes, and then there would be a tax, and you would pay for the shoes, and then the tax, and the shoes would be yours. Now, if somebody came and knocked on your door 6 months from now and said, well, we need another tax on the shoes, you would say, well, I've already paid the tax on the shoes. And then they say, well, yeah, we need another tax. And then they come back 6 months later and 6 months later and so on. And then you ask them, all right, well, what happens if I stop paying this tax on the shoes? Well, we're going to take the shoes away from you. So who owns the shoes? Yeah, whoever it is that's charging you this tax.
Yes.
And that's how it is with property taxes. You have to pay them. And really what's happened to us is we are paying rent to the government on whatever land we live upon.
Let's take modern Israel today for a minute, Gary. We have the heartland of Israel being carved out of the Israeli nation to be given to the Palestinians. If nobody in particular is supposed to own the land, what's the big deal? The whole conflict is over who owns this land.
That's right.
And that has been ever since God gave the land to Joshua and to the children of Israel. And so we have this conflict over the land. And it is the conflict that will bring the world down to Armageddon. Private ownership of the land. Who owns the land? And so these concepts that you've given in these two videos are absolutely essential for Americans to understand. And I urge you to get these two videos from us. They are absolutely essential to your understanding history. Gary, it's been a good program.
Oh, it has been. And Chris Pinto, thanks for coming by. And by the way, we're going to be talking to you even more later.
Yes. Next week, we'll go into this idea again of the architecture of America especially, and all of the Greek architecture. It's going to be a fascinating study. Be sure and get our magazine for December. When you call, order the magazine as well. Got some fascinating articles in there. This is J.R. Church and Gary Stearman. Until next time, keep looking up.